Welcome back, everyone. Today we are embarking on a deep dives into a topic that I think is universally relevant,
Oh, absolutely.
how we learn.
Yeah,
And we're going to be drawing a lot of really fascinating insights from a source that you might not immediately think of when it comes to this topic,
that's right.
the FAA Aviation Instructor's Handbook.
Yep.
So whether you're trying to master some new skill for work or dive into an exciting new hobby, or maybe you're just incredibly curious about the inner workings of your own brain, I think this is going to be really, really interesting.
I think so too, and it's amazing. I mean, this is an incredible source, and it really gets into the nitty-gritty of learning.
And the goal today really is to distill out. I mean,
Yeah.
we've got some good sources here, a good collection of ideas,
Yeah.
but really I want us to try to pull out the most insightful, the most practical, most immediately applicable knowledge from all of this stuff.
Yeah, make it useful for folks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, that stuff that just makes those aha moments click. And we start with this really, really interesting story about Beverly,
Mm-hmm.
who's a student pilot.
Right.
And they talk about how at the beginning of her journey as a student pilot,
Mm.
you know, she's got all this factual knowledge in her head, but she really can't quite connect the dots
Right.
to put it into practice. It's all very mechanical.
It's like, yeah, she can tell you what things are, she can tell you what they do, but then when you actually put her in the pilot seat,
Right.
she struggles to actually make those connections and make it work.
And I think it's something we can all relate to, right?
Yeah.
Whether we're learning to fly an airplane
Absolutely.
or play the piano or write code,
Yeah.
whatever it is,
Right.
we've all had those moments where we feel like,
Yeah.
okay, I know this stuff.
Right.
Why can't I make it work?
Yeah, you're in your head too much, yeah.
And Beverly's journey, I think, is just a wonderful illustration of how effective learning actually unfolds.
Mm.
Because she goes from being this hesitant, unsure beginner to somebody who's confidently managing a bunch of tasks, anticipating potential problems, correcting for mistakes smoothly. You know, it's really the essence of seeing learning in action.
And that really highlights what the goal of an instructor is. Taking somebody from just rote memorization to really
Right.
judgment and problem solving, like Beverly's able to do at the end.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's really what this whole deep dive is about. How do we move beyond just knowing a bunch of facts about something to being able to actually use it in the real world?
Yeah. And the source actually gives us a few definitions of learning.
Okay.
And it's kind of interesting to see the common thread running through all of them. So we see that learning is defined as a change in behavior as a result of experience.
Okay.
And that experience could be physical or intellectual or even attitudinal, right? How we feel about something. Or it could be defined as, a relatively permanent change in behavior that results from experience,
Okay.
leading to the acquisition of new knowledge or skills.
Got it.
And then perhaps the most comprehensive definition that it gives is that learning is a relatively permanent change in a person's knowledge or behavior, which in turn affects their potential behavior.
So it's not just about our actions changing.
Yeah.
It's about our thoughts.
Exactly.
And even our feelings changing.
And our potential actions.
Yes. Yeah, as a result of the things we experience.
Exactly.
And, thinking about that then sort of leads naturally to discussion of the instructor's role.
Mm-hmm.
What is it that a teacher and instructor is supposed to be doing?
Yeah. And it stresses here that to be truly effective, an instructor needs to understand not just the subject matter,
Right.
but also the individual learner
Right.
and the learning process itself.
Okay.
And the interplay of all of these different elements. So the goal isn't just to, fill someone's head with a bunch of facts,
Right.
but to facilitate that transformation that we saw in Beverly
Right.
from initially relying on memory to actually comprehending and being able to flexibly apply that knowledge.
Yeah. And the source provides a really good framework for understanding, how we learn, touching upon some of those foundational learning theories.
Yeah.
And they even mention Piaget and the development of educational psychology.
Yeah.
And then they introduce some of the key theories. We have classical conditioning.
Right. Like Pavlov's dog.
Yeah, Pavlov's dog. Everybody probably remembers that from
Right.
high school.
Yeah.
Where learning occurs through this association between a neutral stimulus and a natural stimulus.
Right. Yeah. So you pair the bell with the food.
Right.
And eventually the dog salivates at just the sound of the bell.
Right. And then operant conditioning, which is that really powerful idea that learning is a function of the consequences of our actions.
Right. So we're talking about reinforcement, both positive and negative. And I think everybody can relate to that, right? Like you think about when you're trying to learn a new skill, like playing a guitar chord or something.
Yeah.
When you finally nail it,
Right.
there's that sense of satisfaction, right? That's
Yeah.
that positive reinforcement. That's your brain saying, hey, do that again.
Right.
That felt good. And understanding this can help us, consciously build in these small rewards,
Right.
when we're tackling challenging skills.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, of course, you have social learning, which, really reflects how we so often learn in the real world,
Yeah, absolutely.
which is Bandura's theory, where he highlights that we learn by observing others, imitating their behavior, and then modeling those behaviors ourselves.
Right.
And the source outlines 4 stages: attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation. So we must pay attention to the behavior.
Uh-huh.
We have to remember it. We have to be able to actually physically reproduce it. And then, of course, have the motivation to do it. So, I mean, like if somebody's trying to learn a new language
Yeah.
and they're actively listening to native speakers
Uh-huh.
and then trying to mimic their pronunciation,
Yeah.
I mean, that would be a direct application of that reproduction stage, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think a lot of language learning apps and programs really take advantage of that. They have you listen and then they have you repeat,
Yeah.
and you get that immediate feedback.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, these theories, they offer a foundation. And then, from these kind of emerge 2 really big concepts in terms of understanding learning. You have behaviorism
Right.
and you have cognitive theory.
Yeah.
And so behaviorism basically is viewing learning as just observable responses
Right.
to some kind of external stimuli.
Yeah.
It's that whole idea of using rewards
Right.
and punishments to shape behavior.
A carrot and stick approach.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, it has some uses today, but it's really fallen out of favor because, well, because it doesn't really account for all the complexities of human thought, and that's where cognitive theory comes in.
Right. Because we're not simply, we're not robots.
Right.
We're not just passively receiving a bunch of triggers
Exactly.
and then responding.
Yeah.
There's more to it than that.
Right. And that's where cognitive theory comes in. It shifts the emphasis from external stimuli and responses to what's going on inside the learner's head.
Right.
So their thinking, their understanding, their problem solving, their feelings.
Yeah.
It's how we process information, not just, the input and output.
Yeah. Yeah. And, within cognitive theory, there are some real heavy hitters. I mean,
Yeah.
we've got John Dewey, who emphasized that idea of reflective thought,
Mm-hmm.
learning by considering our experiences,
Right.
connecting them to things we already know. And then, of course, you have Piaget, his work with assimilation and accommodation, showing how we adjust our understanding when we encounter new information.
Yeah. And then Bruner, who stressed building from the known to the unknown, and he introduced this idea of a spiral curriculum.
Right.
So revisiting ideas at increasingly higher levels of complexity.
Yeah, yeah. And then, of course, you can't talk about learning without talking about Bloom.
Bloom, yeah.
I mean, his name is pretty much synonymous with educational objectives.
Right.
That's where we get Bloom's taxonomy, the cognitive domain,
Mm-hmm.
which provides that hierarchy of thinking skills.
Right. And it starts all the way down at the bottom with knowledge and comprehension and moves up into application, being able to actually use what you know. And then it gets up into those higher levels.
Right.
Analysis, synthesis, and evaluation.
And that's really where the critical thinking,
That's where critical thinking comes in.
problem solving comes into play.
And the thing about Bloom's taxonomy is it's just a really useful structure for understanding, these different levels of intellectual activity.
Right.
So the lower levels are foundational,
Mm-hmm.
but it's those higher levels that really, represent a deeper understanding, right? And, it really can affect how you approach, studying
Yeah.
or how you try to learn complex subjects.
And that leads us very nicely into the concept of constructivism,
Yes.
which, places a strong emphasis on the learner's active role in building their own knowledge.
Exactly. So it's not about passively receiving information. It's about actively constructing understanding based on your experiences.
And it's directly linked to the development of those higher order thinking skills, the HOTS.
The HOTS, yeah. So things like analyzing information, synthesizing different ideas, and evaluating different possible solutions.
Right. And in fields like aviation,
Yeah.
where the source material comes from, these skills are absolutely crucial for things like aeronautical decision making. ADM, yeah.
Yeah.
And they even say that, that when they investigate accidents, often a lack of these higher order thinking skills is a contributing factor.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how do instructors actually teach these HOTS?
So the source mentions things like, problem-based learning,
Yeah.
using real-world scenarios, encouraging active learning, and tailoring instruction to the individual.
Right.
So, it's about engaging the learner in these mental activities,
Right.
prompting them to really, examine their own thinking and explore different solutions. And then, of course, there's scenario-based training, SBT,
Right.
which is really this practical application of those ideas of constructivism
Right.
and problem-based learning. And aviation training, it puts students in these realistic operational environments where they
Yes.
have to make decisions.
Right.
And it's so valuable because it helps them really connect the new information they're learning with what they already know, and to develop those higher order thinking skills in a relevant context. And they highlight that, once the student has the basic skills, the most effective scenarios are actually learner-led.
Right.
So they're involved in formulating the solution, evaluating the options, making a decision, and then reflecting on their own thought process.
It really compels them to think critically.
Exactly.
All this learning begins with something fundamental, right? Perception.
Yeah, perception. It all starts there.
The source says that all learning starts with how we perceive the world around us.
Right.
Through our senses.
Our five senses, right.
And what's interesting, they even say that learning is much faster and more effective when multiple senses are involved.
Yeah.
But perception isn't just about passively receiving sensory information.
Right.
It's about making sense of it.
Assigning meaning to those sensations.
Yeah, and that meaning is influenced by a lot of things, right?
A whole range of factors, both internal and external. So, internally, things like our physical state, our goals and values, our self-concept.
Right.
All of that plays a role. And then externally, things like time, opportunity, even the presence of threat.
And that element of threat.
That's huge.
They say that fear narrows our perceptual field.
Yeah.
Which makes it harder to learn effectively.
Absolutely. I mean, think back to Beverly in her first flight. If the instructor was being impatient or overly critical,
Right.
that would have hindered her ability to take in the information she needed and process it.
So that leads to this concept of insight.
Right.
Which is essentially the grouping of our perceptions into meaningful wholes.
Right.
And, the instructor has a key role here in fostering this by helping the learner to see the relationships between all the different elements of a task.
Yeah.
It's about connecting the pieces.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Because, true understanding requires seeing how all these different factors relate to each other.
Right.
And how a change in one can affect all the others. Insight might occur on its own eventually.
Right.
But effective instruction can really accelerate that process.
By explicitly showing those connections.
Exactly.
Now, when it comes to acquiring knowledge,
Yeah.
the source talks about 3 distinct phases.
Okay.
The first phase is memorization, which is often how we start.
Right.
It lets us get going quickly.
Right. Like Beverly memorizing the steps for setting the altimeter.
Right. But memorization has its limitations.
Oh, absolutely. It only gets you so far.
Because the next stage is understanding,
Right.
which goes beyond just knowing the facts to really comprehending the underlying principles.
Right. So, Beverly understanding why the mixture control needs adjustment
Right.
as altitude changes.
Right.
That's a great example.
And that's where this idea of mental models comes into play.
Right.
Which is that organized collection of knowledge that really forms our understanding.
Yeah.
And then the final stage, which is really the point of all this,
Right.
is application. Actually being able to use this knowledge to solve problems.
Right. So Beverly not just understanding how the mixture control works, but actually being able to adjust it correctly.
Right.
In various flight conditions.
And kind of related to that idea of understanding is concept learning, which is how we as humans take information and group it into categories.
Yeah.
To make sense of the world. And so we generalize. We start with a few specific examples.
Right.
And then we generalize. And then as we get more experience, we refine those categories.
Right.
And they introduce this idea here of schemas,
Right.
which are these cognitive frameworks
Yeah, exactly.
that we use to organize and interpret information. They can be incredibly useful shortcuts.
Yeah.
Like, a pilot,
Right.
an experienced pilot,
Yeah.
who has this schema for understanding an ATC clearance.
Right. Yeah.
But they can also make it hard to learn new information that doesn't fit neatly into our existing schemas.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, think about trying to understand a new genre of music or something like that. Your existing schema for music
Right.
might initially make it difficult to appreciate that new genre.
Right. And, the source also delves into this idea of Thorndike's laws of learning. which are those really fundamental principles that apply to all kinds of learning. So we have readiness, which emphasizes the learner's basic needs being met
Right.
and wanting to learn.
They have to be ready to learn.
And then there's effect, which is that idea that behaviors with satisfying outcomes are more likely to be repeated. And that's where instructors can really capitalize
Right, exactly.
by creating positive training experiences.
Leverage that, yeah.
And then you have exercise, which is, practice makes perfect.
Practice makes permanent, right?
Well, that's true too. Yeah.
Yeah.
The connections are strengthened with practice and weakened without it.
And they added 3 more laws later: primacy, intensity, and recency.
Okay, tell me about those.
So primacy is basically that, what is learned first creates a very strong impression.
Oh, that's interesting.
And then intensity is that, exciting real-world learning is more effective.
Oh, yeah.
So, really intense learning experiences tend to stick with us.
Right.
And then recency is that the things we've learned most recently are the ones that are easiest to remember.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they bring Bloom back in here again.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
this time looking at his classification of the domains of learning.
Mm.
And he identified 3. Cognitive, which is thinking.
Right.
Affective, which is all about feelings, values, and attitudes.
Right.
And then psychomotor, which is doing the physical skills.
Yeah.
And the cognitive domain, like we said, has those 6 levels. But they highlight, in the source 4 really practical levels of learning, right?
Yeah, so rote learning, understanding, application, and then correlation.
Okay, so tell me a little more about those, because these seem really, really important.
Yeah, so rote is just memorizing the information, right? But understanding is when you start to see the relationships between things. And application is when you can actually use that knowledge to solve problems. And then correlation is when you can take what you've learned
Right.
and connect it to other areas.
Can you give me an example?
Sure, yeah. So understanding how wind affects an airplane, that's not just rote knowledge, right?
Right, right.
Applying that understanding to correct for wind drift during, a left turn,
Right.
that's application.
Right.
But then correlating that with, how wind affects landings in different conditions.
Right.
That's correlation.
Oh, I see, I see. So you're really starting to see how all these pieces fit together.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah. And then there's the affective domain, which is harder to measure, but it's so important for motivation.
Yeah, absolutely. And it ranges from, just simple awareness of something all the way up to actually internalizing values. And then the psychomotor domain covers all those physical skills.
Anyway.
Progressing through stages of, observation, imitation, practice, and then ultimately habit.
Right.
So think about learning, a complex maintenance task.
Yeah.
You start by watching. You try to imitate. You practice it over and over
Right.
until it becomes second nature.
So what are some of the overarching characteristics of learning? I mean, what can we say about this process in general?
So the source emphasizes that learning is purposeful. It has to be tied to the learner's goals.
Okay, so we've got to be motivated.
We've got to be motivated. It's a result of experience.
Right.
Active participation is key. It's multifaceted. So it involves these cognitive, emotional, and physical aspects. And it even includes incidental learning.
Incidental learning.
Which is all the things that we pick up along the way
Right.
without really consciously trying.
Right, right.
And fundamentally, learning is an active process.
Not just passively absorbing a bunch of stuff. Right, right. And, they also introduce this idea of learning styles.
Yeah.
Right? Which acknowledges that people have different preferences.
Different preferences for how they learn best, yeah.
Whether they're more visual, auditory, kinesthetic. They even talk about, right brain, left brain dominance.
Yeah, holistic versus serialistic learning. And there's some debate about the science behind specific models.
Right.
But, being aware of these different learning styles can help instructors tailor their approach.
So, for example, if you know somebody's a very visual learner, you're going to use more diagrams and charts and things like that.
Exactly.
Okay, so moving away from acquiring knowledge to acquiring skill knowledge, which is about the doing.
The doing, yeah.
The source outlines 3 stages here: cognitive, associative, and automatic response.
Right.
So take us through those.
So in that cognitive stage, learning is based on, factual knowledge, memorized steps.
Yeah.
Requires full attention.
Like Beverly doing those steep turns in the beginning.
Exactly.
Very focused on the instruments, the procedures.
Right. And then with practice, you move into that associative stage
Uh-huh.
where you start to develop coordination, you start to understand the outcomes of your actions a little bit better,
Hmm.
and you're able to handle distractions better.
So she's starting to anticipate the need for more rudder input
Exactly,
as
yeah.
she gets more and more experience.
Right. And then finally, you reach that automatic response stage
Right.
where the skill becomes very rapid and smooth. It doesn't require as much conscious attention.
She's developing a feel for it.
Exactly.
Yeah. And they talk about the importance here of knowledge of results.
Feedback.
Feedback, yeah.
Knowing when you're right and when you're wrong.
Learners need to know that so they don't keep practicing their mistakes.
Exactly, yeah. And the way we develop skills is largely through practice, following what's called the power law of practice,
Okay.
which is, that rapid improvement you see initially.
Right.
That gradually slows down over time.
And they also introduced that idea of plateaus,
Yeah. Okay.
which, we all experience,
Yeah.
where it's like, we're not getting any better.
Yeah.
And they talk about how to work through those.
Mm.
Sometimes a plateau just means you need to take a break.
Yeah, take a break. You need a fresh perspective.
Yeah.
Or maybe the instructor needs to explain things in a different way.
Yeah. And they talk about different types of practice, right?
Yeah.
So we have deliberate practice.
Right, which is very goal-oriented.
Okay.
You're focusing on specific areas you want to improve.
Right.
And getting very specific feedback. And then there's blocked practice, which is, those repetitive drills.
Right.
And, that might show better results in the short term,
Okay.
but it doesn't lead to as good long-term retention.
And then there's random practice, where you mix up the skills.
Yeah. So you're not just doing the same thing over and over.
Right.
You're doing different things.
Which is better for long-term retention.
Better for long-term retention. And also helps with recognizing patterns.
And then they talk about the idea of overlearning.
Yeah.
Which is basically continuing to study something past the point of proficiency.
Yeah, you keep going.
So you're just like super good at it.
Yeah.
And they talk about how that can be a good thing because it can really streamline your application.
Right.
But it can also be a bad thing because it can lead to those automated routines
Right.
that are kind of decoupled from understanding.
Yeah.
Like, somebody who just recites the checklist without actually thinking about
Right.
the meaning of each item.
Exactly.
And, the critical question that they pose is, can somebody actually take the skills they've learned and apply them in real situations?
Right.
And that's where this idea of transfer of learning comes into play.
Right. Can you take what you've learned in one context and apply it in another?
And, in today's world, everybody talks about multitasking.
Right.
And they kind of debunk this myth a little bit. They say, look, focused attention is a limited resource.
Yeah.
What we're really doing most of the time is attention switching.
Right. Rapidly shifting our focus between tasks,
Right.
which, can lead to errors
Right.
and can lead us to forget, those deferred tasks.
Yeah.
Think about trying to listen to a conversation while you're also trying to read an email.
Right.
You're probably not doing a good job at either.
No. And they talk about, task management.
Yeah.
Which is making sure that you've really practiced the individual tasks well
Right.
before you try to combine them.
Right.
And then, of course, they talk about distractions.
Distractions. Yeah.
Interruptions.
Interruptions.
All huge sources of error.
Absolutely.
They talk about fixation, getting stuck on one thing.
Yeah. Getting overly focused on one task.
Yeah.
And missing other important information.
Like a pilot who's staring at one instrument
Right.
and misses a change in another.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then inattention, which is just failing to pay attention at all
Yeah.
to important tasks. And then they talk about this journey to expertise.
Right.
And they say, look, it takes consistent practice. There's that 10-year rule.
10,000 hours, 10 years. Yeah.
Right. But it's not just about mindlessly practicing.
No, it's about developing those cognitive strategies. So knowing how to approach a problem
Right.
and also having those problem-solving tactics, those specific actions you take to get the results you want.
Right.
And a key part of expertise is actually knowing what you don't know.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah,
So true experts are often really good at knowing what questions to ask.
absolutely, yeah.
They talk about errors, which are an inevitable part of learning.
Right.
And they make a really important distinction between slips, which are errors of action,
Right.
and mistakes, which are
Yeah.
errors of thought.
Right.
Can give me an example?
Sure, yeah. So a slip might be, you intend to, I don't know, turn on the landing light, but you accidentally turn on the taxi light instead.
Right.
Whereas a mistake might be that you misinterpret the weather information.
Right.
And you decide to take off when conditions are actually unsafe.
I see, I see. Yeah, that's a good example.
And, we can't eliminate errors entirely.
Right.
But we can reduce them through, practice, taking our time, checking our work, using reminders like checklists,
Right.
developing good routines,
Right.
and just being aware of the potential for errors.
And most importantly, learning from our mistakes.
Absolutely, yeah. We need to analyze why they happened.
Right.
And be careful about, falling into the hindsight bias trap that, oh, I knew that was going to happen all along.
And then finally, we get to memory.
Memory, yeah.
Which is the crucial link in all this.
Absolutely.
It's about encoding, storing, and retrieving information.
Right.
And we have this widely accepted model of sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory.
Right.
So sensory memory is just that brief initial processing.
Yeah, and it's very selective. We only pay attention to those things that we perceive to be important.
Right.
Like a fire alarm going off.
Right. Yeah, and then short-term memory is temporary. Most people can hold about 7 pieces of information.